Alright, it's time for another drawing in the dark. And this week, well, I'm doing like 2 of these a week now, so I don't know if this week really applies. But this week, we're doing Apocalypse from Marvel Comics, and that really kind of bad showing, not Oscar Isaac's fault, but he played Apocalypse in X-Men Age of Apocalypse. Man, they messed that up. Anyway, what I'm doing here at first, as per usual, in my little sketchbook here, I'm just blocking things out, trying to get like the body shapes and everything down just the way I want them. I already kind of had this idea of using like the sitting ruler kind of posture and position, something that, because some of these bigger scale superheroes or supervillains, they tend to look more powerful in my mind the less they're doing. Where the superheroes tend to look way more interesting the more they're doing, right? So just working things out here, getting in, blocking out a few areas. I had some ideas about a landscape and stuff. That left hand, the one that's like kind of poking out there towards the middle of the page, I really didn't know what I was doing with that one. I do find a solution for it, because I'm recording this after I finish the drawing. So I can tell you now that I do find a good solution for it, but it still, always ends up being a little messy just because of some of the confusion and indecision that I had with working on that hand. Hands are tricky. That's just what's up. But so we're gonna follow along with this particular piece here. And I was thinking about, and I even talked about this on my Patreon video, that I was thinking about talking about apocalypses. And not in a heavily scripted or kind of researched way. I don't have any bullet points or anything like that. But I kind of grew up in, as a Gen Xer and stuff, and in the pop culture that I was really exposed to. I really grew up with an expectation, for the end of the world. Mad Max movies, Blade Runner, so much of what the futuristic pop culture that I consumed, other than stuff like, say, like Star Trek or Back to the Future, there's this tint of like the end times are coming. And, and that's been true in human culture for thousands of years. It seems like every 20 years we've got a new crop of people popping out saying it's the worst it's ever been, the end is coming, we're here in the end times now, here's all the reasons and here's a date, and it never comes. And things tend to, get better or in a way feel worse, and that's been an interesting thing as far as like where we are now. And in fact, it's never been a better time to be alive in human history. It's never been a safer time to be alive. It's never been a time to be more informed or to be connected. Freedom of speech has never been more powerful. Nations, we've never been more aware of the good and the bad that governments and corporations and individuals, groups, communities and stuff, you can really find your people now, and that was really, really hard to do back in the day. Really hard to do. And especially if you weren't in, say, like a populous, a big city. then it got even harder to find your people, especially if your people weren't of the typical zeitgeist. If you're a part of a subculture like me, being part of like being interested in D&D and fantasy and the occult, weird dark stuff, comic books, horror movies, heavy metal, stuff like that, you didn't really have a real wide array of options as far as where you could go, who you could hang out with, or at least people that vibed and shared those interests. It could be really hard to find those interests. And that's not even, that's still pretty mediocre on the scale of individual interests and stuff. So if you had any interest that was, say, more fringe than Dungeons and Dragons, then it got even harder, exponentially harder to find your people. And especially when you start getting into identity groups and stuff where they, where people feel like they have to hide these interests and these identities, then it becomes even that much harder to find your people. And so now, it's so much easier to find your people. It's so much easier to sculpt your life in a way that fits any ideation that you have. Frankly, in the past, you just lived how, the prevailing culture instructed you to live. The opportunity to deviate from that was much lower, and came with much greater costs than now. And someone disagreeing with you on social media, they'd literally run you out of town, literal lynchings, literal burnings at the stake, literal crucifixions. Take your pick throughout time. The further back you go, the crazier it gets. And we've always lived with these concepts of the Armageddon, the end times, the end of days. And we manufacture and buy into it over and over and over again. Where even more recently, 2012 and the end of the Mayan calendar. Before that, it was Y2K with the computer glitch. Before that, it was, I think it was something like in 94, 96, the Branch Davidians. Hale Bop with all the people, in their tracksuits and stuff that committed mass suicide because they believed it was the end of times were coming, they're going to go hop on a comet. And before that, what do we have? Jonestown with the Kool-Aid, and then you have stuff like Nostradamus and biblical end-time prophecies with the Book of Revelations. At least in Western culture, it's been pretty prevalent, damn near as far back as you can go. And, Armageddon, that's a term that comes from, the battles on the hill of Megiddo, Har Megiddo. And anyway, and then so we have all this modern culture, science fiction stories and stuff that tell of an end times and apocalypse, stuff like that. And it seems, I don't know, it seems like in a way, so many ways we're really hungry for it. And, almost like we'll make it that way if it doesn't end up that way. Just because we want that so much, we almost want to a point a reset, it's just whose reset is it going to be, and I really don't think, and I've been in love with these concepts. I've gotten into so many different versions. I've read tons of stuff about the Mayan calendar. I've been really, really interested, and not so much as like some hardcore believer, but as a person that was curious, that was interested, that wanted to learn more. And as a storyteller and as an artist, there's been some amazing art and visualization and human condition expressed through these concepts of the end times. And there's been some terrible times in history as well, the Dark Ages in Europe and stuff. Colonization, mass colonization across the planet, that was not really a great time for the vast majority of cultures involved. and apocalyptic even. If you could even imagine that some of these cultures after British colonization did experience to a degree an apocalypse, an end of their way of life, an end of their paradigm, an imposed paradigm, where those eras and stuff, the fall of Rome, an apocalypse that led to the Dark Ages in Europe. The failure of these empires and stuff really can kind of lead to these stages of decline and diminishment in knowledge and education and technological capabilities, an increase in general ignorance, fear, superstition, suspicion, and we could, there's some people that wouldn't mind bringing back something that looks a lot like the Spanish Inquisition, just to root out people that bothered them for whatever reason, cultural or ideological, that they might be, in opposition to. It's not like cancel culture is new or anything. It's just not quite in what real cancel culture was, say, 100 years ago. And that's a good way to look at it too. Like, if you want to see how much better now is than any other point in the past, look back at what life was like just 100 years ago, 1924. And that was on an upswing, but we have the benefit of history to know that in 10 years from 1924 to 1934 was not a good time. Clearly now is better than the early onset of World War II, post-World War I, and global economic depression. 100 years ago. 200 years ago. That's 1824. I don't think that was a really great time for a lot of people either. This is a time that was kind of like leading into the early stages of the Civil War. The Civil War was what, in the 1840s, 1850s, something like that, 1860s. And so, you definitely had movements towards that, and the experience of being a slave in those times and everything. It was not a great time. 1824 was not a great time to be alive. 1724, under British, colonial rule, regardless of who you were, you really weren't having, a great time unless you were British in Britain, because I don't think the British in the colonies were necessarily always having a great time either. A lot of them didn't seem to want to be here either. And, okay, so 1724, 1624, you can't even imagine. You can't even fathom it. It's inconceivable. So yeah, now is better in nearly every conceivable measure than any other time. And so making anything great again doesn't make sense to me. Going back to the good old days doesn't make sense to me. There are no good old days. I had a lot of fun in the 90s when I was in my 20s, and that I think had more to do with me being in my 20s than it was being in the 90s, But anyway, that's it. We're done. Pop Culture Classics is the podcast. You can check that out. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/mopandbucket. We got the books on the Amazon, the Comic Book Planner, All Skulls, and the Curse of the Jade Monkey Activity Book. Links are all in the description. So, it won't be that hard to find. And I'm going to sneak in more weird stuff here, after the algorithms, or after the analytics say that people stop listening, I think is when I'm going to start slipping into talking about some more crazier shit that I'm into. So, but so here's the end of the video, and we'll catch you guys later.